And one of the most striking is that humans, our ancestors, interbred with Neanderthals. This is about 50,000 years ago that this happened. And there's still a remnant of that interbreeding in the genomes of many modern humans living today.
Look at a map of Neanderthal fossils, and you'll see them clustered almost entirely across Europe and Western Asia. Basic logic says modern Europeans should carry the highest percentage of Neanderthal DNA, but they don't. When geneticists finally map these ancient genomes side by side, they hit a geographical impossibility. It turns out modern Chinese populations carry up to 20% more Neanderthal DNA than Europeans. How did an ancient hominin leave its heaviest genetic footprint thousands of miles away from home? The geographical paradox. In 2015, a team of geneticists at the University of Washington ran a comparative analysis on hundreds of modern genomes and hit a mathematical wall. For decades, the story of human migration was treated like a straightforward line. Early humans migrated out of Africa, bumped into Neanderthals somewhere around the Middle East and Europe, and eventually settled down right there in the neighborhood. Based on that timeline, Europeans should theoretically be the most Neanderthal-heavy people on the planet. They are literally living on top of the fossils. You would expect their genetic code to reflect that deep, overlapping history perfectly, but the numbers completely refuse to cooperate. When Dr. Joshua Akey, a professor of genome sciences at the University of Washington, led a massive sequencing project, the data showed the exact opposite of what the old models predicted. The results were published in the American Journal of Human Genetics in February 2015, and they definitively broke the standard timeline. East Asian genomes don't just have a little bit of archaic material scattered around. They contain exactly 20% more Neanderthal sequence than European genomes. That 20% gap is massive. We aren't talking about a statistical rounding error or a slight regional variation. Akey's team measured a highly specific, undeniable 20% surplus of Neanderthal genetic material in populations living thousands of miles away from where Neanderthals actually existed. Now, does a higher percentage mean East Asians are somehow a completely different evolutionary branch? Not exactly. A retained sequence is evidence of different ancient encounters, not a completely separate origin. But when the numbers are that stark, it proves our assumptions about human history were fundamentally flawed. Let's talk about the single mixing theory, which is basically the old assumption that ancient humans and Neanderthals only had one big interbreeding event before our ancestors spread across the globe. Akey's data proved that a single event couldn't mathematically produce the modern genomes we see today. If Neanderthals never lived in China, how did their genetic code end up deeply embedded in East Asian DNA? To figure that out, researchers had to map archaic introgression, which is just a technical way of saying they tracked exactly where ancient DNA slipped into our modern gene pool. They were analyzing the precise genetic sequences that survived tens of thousands of years of evolution. At first, some experts assumed this massive discrepancy was just a flaw in the early testing methods. They thought that if they just ran the sequences again with better equipment, the European and Asian numbers would eventually balance out. Instead, the gap held firm. The populations living exactly where Neanderthals thrived possessed significantly less of their DNA than populations living on the other side of the continent. It meant the story of human genetics wasn't just a simple line of inheritance. It was a complex web that scientists were only just beginning to untangle. For years, scientists debated how East Asians acquired this extra ancient DNA. Did they encounter a rogue band of Neanderthals further east? The answer, it turned out, wasn't about East Asians gaining DNA. It was about what happened to the Europeans and the invisible ghost population that erased their past, the ghost dilution. The missing European Neanderthal DNA wasn't lost. It was aggressively washed out by an ancient demographic invasion. When researchers stopped trying to figure out how Asian populations gained extra ancient DNA and started looking at how European populations might have lost theirs, the entire paradox flipped upside down. Finding the answer wasn't about uncovering a genetic surplus in the East. It was about tracking a massive genetic erasure in the West. In September 2014, a landmark study published in the journal Nature cracked this mystery wide open. Dr. Iosif Lazaridis, working at the Department of Genetics at Harvard Medical School, was analyzing the genomes of early European hunter-gatherers and early farmers. His team wasn't just looking at surface-level traits, they were digging deep into the oldest layers of the European gene pool, and they hit a massive anomaly. Researchers discovered the clear signature of a completely unknown group they called the basal Eurasians. These basal Eurasians are what geneticists refer to as a ghost population, which basically means a distinct group of ancient humans whose physical fossils have never been dug out of the ground, but whose genetic shadow still exists hidden inside our own DNA. We know they walked the Earth because their code is permanently woven into ours, even if their physical skeletons are completely missing from the fossil record. How much of our history is shaped by populations whose bones we have literally never found? What makes the basal Eurasians so critical to this mystery is their timing. This specific lineage split off from the rest of humanity long before anyone had the chance to interbreed with Neanderthals. Because of that early evolutionary exit, they carried exactly 0% Neanderthal genes. When these ancient people eventually migrated into Europe and mixed with the hunter-gatherers already living there, they acted like a giant genetic flood. According to the data pulled by Dr. Lazaridis and his team, this ghost lineage contributed up to 44% of modern European ancestry. That is a staggering number. Nearly half of the modern European genome comes from this single ancient group carrying a perfectly clean slate of DNA. Now, does this mean European DNA was completely overwritten? Not entirely. Genetics is about complex blending, not just wiping the slate clean. But this influx of 0% Neanderthal DNA fundamentally changes the math. Early Europeans didn't avoid Neanderthals at all. They were just heavily hybridized with a massive population that had never met one. Chinese populations didn't necessarily start out with way more Neanderthal DNA than their Western counterparts. Instead, Europeans simply had theirs heavily diluted over thousands of years. Ancient populations in Asia didn't experience this specific basal Eurasian flood, so they naturally held on to the original, higher levels of archaic ancestry that early humans picked up during their first migrations. The basal Eurasian dilution perfectly explained why Europeans had less archaic DNA. The math finally balanced. But just as geneticists thought they had solved the European side of the equation, a massive genomic study in 2018 looked closer at the Chinese genome and found something that shattered the timeline all over again: the second pulse. If the math had stopped at the European dilution, the mystery would have been solved. But the genetic code of modern East Asians held an additional shocking layer. When researchers Benjamin Vernot and Dr. Joshua Akey at the University of Washington looked closer at their data, they realized the numbers still weren't adding up perfectly. The basal Eurasian ghost population explained why European DNA was heavily diluted, which certainly accounted for a large chunk of that 20% gap. But when they ran the numbers, that massive wash of 0% DNA still wasn't quite enough to explain the highly specific, archaic sequences they were finding in modern Chinese genomes. The European dilution was only half the story. To figure out the rest, Vernot and Akey relied on computational genomic simulations, which is basically a fancy way of saying they used high-powered computers to run thousands of virtual timelines of human migration to see which historical scenario actually matched the DNA we carry today. When they published their findings in the American Journal of Human Genetics, the algorithms pointed to a massive plot twist. East Asians didn't just passively avoid the genetic dilution happening over in Europe. They actively acquired a brand new batch of archaic genes. The researchers called this the two-pulse model of admixture. In plain English, admixture is just the scientific term for two entirely different populations meeting up and having children together. The first pulse happened when all humans originally left Africa and mixed with Neanderthals in the Middle East. But the simulation models proved that long after the ancestors of modern Europeans and Asians split up and migrated their separate ways, the Asian lineage kept moving east, and somewhere along that epic journey, they ran into a completely different, isolated group of Neanderthals. They bred with them a second time. This created a permanent divergence in our genomes. It meant that the 20% surplus in East Asian DNA wasn't just some preserved leftover from the original human migration. It was a fresh, secondary injection of ancient genetics that happened entirely independently. Now, does a second pulse mean there was a massive, sprawling empire of Neanderthals covering the entire Eastern Hemisphere? Not exactly. Small pockets of ancient hominins can leave incredibly large genetic footprints if the human population absorbing them is also relatively small. But the fact that this divergence occurred long after the initial European and Asian split proves that there was a geographically distinct second encounter. What forces drove these migrating humans to interbreed with ancient hominins not just once, but every time they encountered them? We are still trying to figure out the behavioral side of that equation. But the biological truth is undeniable. The high levels of archaic DNA in modern East Asians aren't a quirky accident of genetic preservation. They are the direct result of humans breeding with Neanderthals multiple times across vast and unforgiving continents, entirely rewriting their own evolutionary trajectory in the process. This second pulse of Neanderthal DNA proved that the deep history of East Asia was far more chaotic than previously believed. But Neanderthals were a known quantity. What geneticists found hiding in the Han Chinese genome in 2018 wasn't Neanderthal at all, the Denisovan double strike. When scientists stripped away the Neanderthal data to look deeper into the archaic code, they found the signature of an entirely different human species, one that Europeans completely missed. For years, geneticists knew about the Denisovans, a mysterious sister species to Neanderthals that roamed parts of ancient Asia. If you trace the European evolutionary lineage, you will find exactly zero Denisovan ancestry, because those populations never crossed paths. But for the ancient ancestors of modern East Asians, the genetic landscape was wildly different, incredibly complex, and far more crowded. Modern East Asian DNA serves as an incredible biological archive of at least 3 separate massive hybridization events with 2 completely different extinct human species. In March 2018, Dr. Sharon Browning, a biostatistics professor at the University of Washington, published a fascinating study in the journal Cell that completely upended our understanding of these ancient encounters. Her research team wanted to map exactly where this archaic genetic material was hiding. To achieve this, they applied a new statistical method known as SPRIME. You can think of SPRIME as an advanced computational algorithm built to aggressively scan through modern genomes and isolate the specific mutations that could only come from our extinct human cousins. Because different ancient populations have distinct genetic fingerprints, this tool can trace exactly who contributed what to our modern code. When Browning's team turned this algorithm loose on the genomes of Han Chinese and Japanese individuals, the data revealed something totally unprecedented. They discovered 2 distinct pulses of Denisovan ancestry. We aren't talking about a faint trace or a single isolated mixing event. The researchers isolated 2 entirely different waves of genetic integration. One pulse perfectly matched the genetic signature of the Denisovans found in the freezing Altai Mountains of Siberia, which scientists already knew about. The second pulse, however, was a complete shock. It came from a a unique southern strain of Denisovans that had never been seen before in any genomic record. This completely unknown population had a totally different genetic makeup than their northern relatives, proving that Denisovans were far more widespread than anyone previously believed. Now, does finding two separate genetic signatures prove there was a massive unified Denisovan empire stretching all the way from Siberia down to the tropics? Not quite. Diverse genetic lines usually point to smaller, heavily isolated groups scattered across very extreme environments. A fragmented population is still evidence, not an empire. But this double strike of interbreeding definitively shows that migrating human populations didn't just casually brush past these ancient hominins. They lived alongside them, mixed with them, and heavily absorbed their biology over and over again in highly distinct geographical zones. This creates an incredible archaeological blind spot. If there was a vast southern population of Denisovans interacting with early Chinese populations, where are their fossils hidden today? The discovery of a double pulse of Denisovan DNA alongside a double pulse of Neanderthal DNA proved that the genetic crucible of ancient Asia was unlike anywhere else on Earth. But these archaic codes aren't just dead history. Tens of thousands of years later, these specific genes are actively altering human bodies. So how exactly is this ghost DNA still controlling our biology today? The 30,000-year mutation, the invisible collision of human and archaic genetics, eventually boiled over into profound, visible, physical transformations. For the first part of this investigation, we have been looking at ancient mixing purely as a numbers game. We tracked missing percentages in the West and mapped surplus sequences in the East. But the genetic code isn't just a historical ledger keeping track of who met whom. It operates as a live blueprint that actively builds the human body. How exactly do you trace a modern physical trait back to a prehistoric mixing event? While European populations were having their ancient DNA aggressively diluted by the Basal Eurasian ghost lineage, populations settling in ancient Asia were experiencing a drastically different reality. They weren't just picking up extra archaic DNA from secondary Neanderthal and Denisovan pulses, though we know that happened. Their bodies were fiercely adapting to entirely new, extreme environmental pressures. The profound physical differences you see between distinct human populations today aren't random quirks of nature. They are the direct, measurable result of highly localized genetic mutations firing off in response to brutal, demanding living conditions over thousands of years. In 2013, a major study published in the journal Cell mapped exactly how this biological shift happened. Dr. Pardis Sabeti, a computational biologist at the Broad Institute, led a massive research effort to figure out how human bodies adapted to different climates across the globe. Her team was actively hunting for evidence of positive selection. In the genetics world, positive selection is basically the process where a random mutation gives someone a massive survival advantage, causing that specific trait to spread incredibly fast through a population. They struck gold when they looked at the EDAR gene. Dr. Sabeti's team zeroed in on a very specific variant called the EDARV370A mutation. While it sounds like a serial number for a machine part, this mutation acts like a powerful biological toggle switch that controls how certain tissues develop in the human body. By analyzing the genetic decay rate around this specific sequence, researchers managed to pinpoint the exact time and place the switch flipped. The data showed that this unique mutation arose exactly 30,000 years ago in central China. The physical effects of this genetic shift were dramatic and permanent. The researchers proved that the EDARV370A variant directly causes thicker hair shafts, a significantly increased density of sweat glands, and a unique dental formation known as shovel-shaped incisors. These aren't vague, subjective features. You can literally measure the increased thickness of the hair and count the higher density of sweat glands under a microscope today. These exact traits are highly prevalent in modern East Asian and Native American populations, yet they are entirely missing from European lineages. Now, does an increase in sweat glands and thicker hair mean these ancient humans evolved into a completely different subspecies? Absolutely not. Minor surface-level adaptations are simply localized survival mechanisms, not deep evolutionary splits. But when a mutation spreads this universally through one specific geographic group and entirely misses another, it proves that the environment was violently forcing their biology to change. Are there other invisible ancient mutations currently driving how our bodies function today without us even knowing? The answer is almost certainly yes, and geneticists are unearthing new examples in the lab every single year. The unique genetic crucible of East Asia isn't just a story about populations holding onto a higher percentage of Denisovan or Neanderthal code. It is a story about how those archaic encounters paired with incredibly powerful, highly localized mutations like EDAR V370A built a completely unique framework for human survival. When you look at the genetic blueprint of humanity, you realize that nothing happens by accident. The ancestors of modern Europeans didn't require extra sweat glands to regulate their body temperature or thicker hair to protect them in their specific climate, so their biological code ignored the mutation entirely. The ancient populations navigating the complex environments of central China absolutely did need those specific physical traits, so their bodies adapted at a staggering pace to keep them alive. From the deep history of ghost lineages to a 30,000-year-old mutation that changed human biology, the comparison of these ancient genomes forces us to abandon everything we thought we knew about our isolated past. Outro. So the next time you look at your own DNA, remember it is an ancient map of thousands of years of survival, migration, and hidden encounters. Was our history written by the people we recognize or by the ghost populations we barely know? If our ancestors hadn't crossed paths with these long-extinct species, would we even be here today? This entire story is still being rewritten by the data. If you enjoyed this investigation, leave a comment and subscribe for more deep dives.